The Virtue of Playfulness by Boomer Trujillo, Chapter 2. Aristotle on being happy, virtuous, and maybe playful. Room for playfulness in Aristotle. Maybe there was one time where I dressed myself in a Nacho Libre luchador mask and my dog in a taco costume. And maybe we played fetch throughout my house while I spoke to her in Spanish. While that action might give you some indication of who I am and how I interact with the world, it would give you much more information if you knew that I did this hypothetically at the beginning of every month after I watched Nacho Libre again. There is a fundamental difference between one-time actions and repeated actions that turn into habits and ways we automatically interact with the world. These dispositions that describe how we consistently act throughout our lives are called character traits, and Aristotle largely pioneered their philosophical study. As we saw in the previous chapter, Aristotle had a lot to say about play as an action, but he had nothing to say about playfulness as a virtue, a moral character trait. I think this is strange given how much he talked about play, so this chapter speculates about how Aristotle might have talked about playfulness, even though he did not. Two quick notes on terminology. First, philosophers sometimes differentiate ethical and moral in precise ways. Usually they relate ethical to wider scope considerations about who a person is, what kind of life she leads, and the social situations she faces. These macro level concerns are used to contextualize what a person does, whereas moral tends to delve into principles, norms, and other subjective things surrounding individual actions and the obligations they generate. The moral tends to be focused on the micro level. However, I use the terms interchangeably despite judging the ethical almost always more important. Technically, I am doing virtue ethics here, and I think the ethical is the more accurate term in this context. But the contemporary literature about character is located in the field of moral psychology and calls the traits moral character traits, so I will use moral too. Second, and even more important, the distinction between playfulness and play is crucial to maintain here. Play is an action. Playfulness is a virtue. And like any virtue, playfulness is a moral character trait. A person develops a character trait through repeated action that forms a disposition. Basically, we as humans face certain situations repeatedly throughout our lives, and our repeated responses to these situations ingrain into us patterns of thinking, feeling, and doing. Character traits are psychologically holistic attributes about who a person is and what she values. Character traits involve knowledge, emotion, and motivation. In our case, a playful person is not only someone who plays on one occasion. She plays consistently and well throughout her life. Additionally, she does not play against her will or in inappropriate contexts. Rather, she knows when to play, feels good about playing, and is motivated to play well in any relevant context. The play, or any action relevant to playfulness, is done intentionally, and so it reflects who she is. But playfulness is not merely a character trait. It is a moral character trait, a virtue. I am making a much stronger claim than saying that playfulness merely describes a person. Character traits in the weak, non-moral sense describe how a person consistently dresses, speaks, moves, etc., as in a novel or script. Non-moral traits might tell us tendencies about a character, but pass few judgments and indicate little about how well that person's life is going. For example, knowing that my neighbor likes to wear the color black and listen to the Misfits will not necessarily tell me whether she is a good person. Those character traits do describe her, but they have little to do with her moral characteristics. By contrast, I am going beyond mere descriptions and toward passing judgments when I talk about moral character or virtues and vices. I am saying playfulness is a virtue, which for me means that any person possessing this character trait has a better chance at living a full, flourishing human life. Inversely, without developing playfulness, people cannot live that full, characteristically good human life. Returning to my neighbor, if I found out that she spent her Sunday afternoons for the past few years visiting the elderly in my neighborhood to see if they needed help with any chores, this would indicate that she is a good person in at least some respects. Similarly, for me, knowing that someone is playful tells us much more about her than knowing only that she prefers the game Toe Jam and Earl to Super Mario World. While not morally neutral, actions of play have lower stakes than fully developed moral character traits like playfulness. Watching fine cinema starring Black Jack on a random Saturday afternoon is judged differently than taking every possible opportunity to do so with both you and your dog in costume. As you might guess from my examples and tone, I am not limiting myself to Aristotle's extant words. I am speculating about playfulness by extrapolating from the things that Aristotle definitively said to the things that I think he might say but did not. Even though I move from strict exegesis of Aristotle to novel applications of his ideas in this chapter, there are a few good reasons to do this. This is not merely speculation, though it involves some. First, Aristotle realized that his ethical works could not handle every topic for every audience on every occasion. He placed several limitations on his philosophy. Concerning his audience, he acknowledged that he addressed a limited set of Greek citizens, relying on them to share a common moral education and fill in details where necessary. Concerning his subject matter, he explicitly constrained his subject to action, remarking that he was unconcerned with systematic rules for deliberation and precise ways to predicate quantities like goodness. He was content to offer outlines about ethics because he wanted to understand the ethical phenomena in his community in a practical way. And concerning his method, he famously said, "For it is the mark of an educated person to look for precision in each class of things just so far as the nature of the subject admits. It is evidently equally foolish to accept probable reasoning from a mathematician and to demand from a rhetorician demonstrative proofs." In other words, wise people understand that the standards for evidence change depending on what the conversation is about. In math, we should expect tight proofs, not just pretty words. In ethics, however, no such standard can be achieved. So we are left with analyzing how actual people live, what the opinions of people are, and whether we think that the values under consideration help us to live up to our human potential and lead worthwhile lives. The way that Aristotle added caveats to his conversation shows that he did not take his works to be the be-all, end-all take. Second, circumstances can change considerably when we evaluate things. We might not initially have the exact words that we need to make our points clear. Being wise to his limits, Aristotle left his system open to addition. One bit of evidence for his openness is that he explicitly mentions that certain virtues and vices are nameless, or in the Greek, anonymos. We often understand that changing our character in certain ways can impact whether we live well, even though we do not always have the words for the traits that we develop. Aristotle uses courage to illustrate this phenomenon. People who face fear well are deemed courageous. People who feel too much fear on too many occasions are called cowardly. But what do we call those people who do not feel fear at all, for whom fear is never a factor in calculations when deciding what to do? If such people rush into action, we might call them rash or reckless. But if they're not prone to action, we have no word for them. These tranquil few who are unafraid in all circumstances, yet resist the urge to say, "Hold my beer," before departing for foolishness. Human personalities are complicated, and Aristotle allows for the amendment of his system to capture such complexity. He himself did not have words to describe each and every way that humans develop themselves, and he knew that he was starting an ongoing conversation, not a complete and closed catalog of all human possibilities. Third, Aristotle is explicit about the fact that experience is the primary content of our ethical systems. Because experiences change, ethics changes. Ethics for Aristotle is not an a priori exercise in finding immutable, absolute, universal truths about goodness or rightness divorced from anyone's experience. Ethics, for Aristotle, is about becoming a good person and living a good life in the here and now. And you cannot do that if you do not understand how the world works and how you might fit into it. The role of experience is so important for Aristotle's ethics that he argues that young people are not good at studying ethics or politics precisely because they lack experience. Aristotle prioritizes experience in his ethical method. People thinking about character and the good life must draw on the lived experiences of themselves and others, and changes in this experiential data will change ethical theories. Aristotle acknowledges that there are gaps in his system and that experience will change the considerations. These remarks lead me to think that there might be room in Aristotle's system for playfulness, even though he himself named no such trait. But to call playfulness a virtue or a good moral character trait, we need to understand what virtues are and how they interact with happiness, both for Aristotle and for myself as an Aristotelian. And that is the goal of this chapter, to explain fundamental concepts in Aristotelian ethics. I hope that explaining them can show you how Aristotle's ethical system works and why playfulness might be compatible with Aristotle's traditional virtues such as courage, temperance, wisdom, and justice. Happiness and virtues in Aristotle. Why happiness matters. We all want to be happy, eudaimon, or so Aristotle assumes. Unlike Plato, who dedicates the first part of Republic to combating moral skepticism and realpolitik, Aristotle takes it as a given that his readers want to live good lives and be good people. Insofar as we are human animals with healthy, functioning minds, we want to be happy. For him, the central debate about happiness is not whether we want it. We do. The fundamental debate surrounds the definition of happiness. To begin his argument, Aristotle surveys the extant views on happiness in ancient Greece. Common people hold that happiness is pleasure. It is a life of consumption. Citizens, people who own land and vote, think that happiness is honor. It is a political life reaping the benefits of good reputation. And philosophers think that happiness is something intellectual, belonging to the best parts of our souls when contemplating theoretical truths. Yet other people think that happiness consists in wealth, good fortune, or virtue. In setting out the available views on happiness, Aristotle does two things. First, he avoids questions about whether happiness is important by showing that most people already acknowledge its significance. People have opinions about what happiness is, thus showing that they care. Additionally, nothing theoretical diminishes the practical importance of conversations about happiness. For example, neither the inherent imprecision in ethico-political debates nor deep disagreements keep us from having productive conversations. Whatever the theory, people literally live and die by their ideas of happiness. For example, as when people value and pursue wealth at all costs. What further proof would Aristotle need for the critic who says that these debates do not matter? And even if we cannot prove definitively what happiness is, how can this undermine how relentlessly people pursue it? Aristotle would simply show that some people live well, while others suffer due to the paths that they have charted on their maps of the good life. Second, in surveying extant views on happiness, Aristotle acknowledges that somatic and external goods are important to someone who wants to live a good life. Somatic goods are goods relating to the body, such as health and beauty. External goods are things such as wealth, honor, friends, and the political circumstances we live in, things entirely separate from our bodies. Most people want some part of health, money, reputation, and meaningful connections to their communities. Without health, people experience debilitating pain. Without money, people writhe in poverty. Without friends, people cannot socialize, receive help, or pursue complex and edifying projects that require cooperation. And without reputation, power, or justice, people experience scorn, vulnerability, and oppression. This in no way entails that people must be gorgeous, wealthy, popular, and in perfect circumstances to flourish. Aristotle explicitly says that we only need moderate amounts of somatic and external goods. Instead, this observation laments that the ugly, poor, lonely, and powerless will struggle more in life than the beautiful, wealthy, beloved, and powerful. If we have to assess, or if we have access to somatic and external goods, it makes life better than if we do not. Unfortunately, health, beauty, wealth, and political circumstances are outside of our control. They are largely a matter of luck. But for Aristotle, these differences in luck affect how virtuous we can be or how happy we can become. Happy life involves luck, and our happiness and virtue are vulnerable to misfortune. By acknowledging the role of external goods, Aristotle concedes partial truth to his opponents. Even if happiness is more than wealth, power, pleasure, reputation, it certainly involves them, as happiness is easier to accomplish with their aid. Aristotle thus runs a somewhat conciliatory program that integrates many views on happiness into his own. But his on-the-ground observation that people already prefer some lives to others allays the attacks of critics who demand theoretical precision when it has no practical impact. No matter your theoretical persuasion, if given an option about what kind of life you could live, you would choose one with beauty, health, wealth, honor, and justice rather than one without these things. These are not matters of indifference. What happiness is. It cannot be overemphasized that happiness, for Aristotle, differs radically from our contemporary colloquial use of the term. Happiness today is often associated with a short-term emotional state of a person, as when feeling happy. But for Aristotle, happiness was a long-term accomplishment of an entire life lived well, a complete life lacking nothing important. In short, Aristotle defines happiness as a life of virtue and reason. For Aristotle, one could feel miserable after illness, divorce, or loss, but still be considered happy. This is because happiness transcends mere feelings. Instead, happiness is an ascribed quality of people who have developed themselves in the best possible ways and led full, flourishing human lives. Happiness is a long-term accomplishment, not a short-term sensation, emotion, or mood. For Aristotle, happiness is the most purely intrinsic good in life. We pursue it solely based on its own merits and without appeal to anything else. We do not choose happiness because we want pleasure, honor, wealth, or anything else. We choose it for its own sake. Everything else in life, by contrast, is at least partially instrumental or chosen because it helps to accomplish some other task. Why do we want money? Well, it buys bean burritos, nice apartments, or the feeling of security that comes from a retirement fund. The money serves goals other than its mere possession. Why do we want happiness? We just do, and it needs no other justification for its pursuit. This feature of intrinsicness provides a deliberative function too. When uncertain about what to do, we can ask ourselves what would add to our lives in this deep way, a way that makes our lives complete. Not sure whether to take a new promotion, but certain that it will add much more stress and take time away from your loved ones? Aristotle would advise that if you did not need the money, you should prefer your friends, family, and the time that they contribute to your flourishing more than the money would in this case. The pursuit of money needs justification in ways that the pursuit of happiness does not. Happiness is central to Aristotle's ethics, largely due to its unique qualities. Compared to other goods in life, such as wealth, health, reputation, and luck, happiness is the most architectonic, the highest of all goods of actions, the most complete, and the best, most noble, and most pleasant. Moreover, it does not change with a person's circumstances, it belongs to a person alone. Once achieved, it is hard to take away and nearly incorruptible. Happiness is self-sufficient. It is even more steadfast and stable than knowledge, a surprising admission from a philosopher. Happiness is the best of all goods in life, and it is the most durable. It seems of a different sort than money or reputation, and compared to money or reputation, happiness weathers misfortune better. So how do we achieve happiness? It requires many things. Like plants, we humans develop as healthy entities, nourishing ourselves and growing. Like animals, we must perceive and interact with the world around us, often forming desires and moving toward their fulfillment. But unlike plants and animals, we must learn to cultivate the self, act according to reason, and act according to virtue. Human happiness relies on mental capacities that non-humans lack, as far as we can tell. Happy people set themselves the lifelong project of becoming the best that they can. They use their reason to train their emotions, motivations, and dispositions to act virtuously on a consistent basis. But how do we know what leads to the best development of ourselves? Here, Aristotle grounds happiness in the function of human animals. He makes two central claims about human happiness. First, happiness needs to be something distinct about humans compared to other living beings. This rules out nutrition, growth, perception, action, and desire because plants and animals can do these things too. Human happiness requires something more, even though it certainly includes aspects of life that we share with plants and animals. Second, in looking for the distinct human function, Aristotle wants to find the quality that generalizes to all happy people. He analogizes humans to kithara players. If kithara players can be defined as a group, as those who play the kithara well, Humans must have some similar function that defines them. Aristotle thinks that this common capacity for happy people is the activity of the mind according to virtue. And whenever people cultivate their minds to lead a life according to virtue, they fulfill their human function the best, and therefore they lead happier lives. Consistently, Aristotle argues that the best things, the highest pleasures, and the most durable goods are those that perfect us, those that help us to achieve our highest purpose, our telos. This is what Aristotle thinks our reason and character do. If people develop their minds and create good habits to respond to life's challenges, then they live as well as humanly possible. Cultivated minds live excellently. Happiness, therefore, is not an acquired product or an isolated action, nor is it a mere state of mind. Happiness is a deep cultivation of one's capacities to develop the uniquely human attributes that lead to a flourishing human life. It involves the careful management of the many things that we care about: health, wealth, friends, family, career, social standing, etc. By living according to reason and cultivating virtues, people have the best chance of achieving happiness. The goal is to become good people and lead good lives. Good character, good living, and the goods of life mutually reinforce each other. Why we need virtues for happiness. For Aristotle, people want to be happy, and they can be happy only by fulfilling their specific function as human animals, living a life according to virtue. Virtues, therefore, are necessary components of being a happy person. They are part of what defines a good human, and they are common to all happy people. Those who develop the virtues become better people and lead better lives as a result. Aristotle is quick to emphasize that virtues are natural capacities. But by natural capacities, he does not mean that they develop automatically. If people were automatically immoral or moral, they would be unable to change, and this would confound moral instruction and correction. Yet, just because it takes work to develop virtues does not mean that it goes against some rigid human nature. Training someone to become good is not foolish in a way that training a rock to fall upward is. Aristotle contrasts virtues with our senses. We use sight or smell because we have them. But virtues are things that we have because we use them. Both are natural, but they're developed in different ways. People develop their capacities for character into actuality through moral education and self-cultivation. Virtues are developed through proper forms of habituation. This comes out especially in the Greek word for virtue, arete. Not only can we translate it as virtue, but also as excellence. Virtues are excellent ways of being, especially with respect to common experiences, situations, and goods that all humans interact with. Aristotle connects virtues to situations that all humans face. You can think of virtues as psychological tools that specialize to work on each situation uniquely. For every situation or emotion that humans face, that will impact their ability to flourish significantly, there is an Aristotelian virtue that helps regulate it. For example, because we all face fear, we need a virtue of courage. Because we all face pleasure, we need a virtue of temperance. Or because we all have access to goods, we need a virtue of generosity. Virtues regulate emotions or situations in life that all humans face universally. And happy people need to develop the virtues to face these situations well. Whether we want to or not, we repeatedly face these situations and develop habits toward them. If we develop good characters, we stand a chance at flourishing. If we develop bad characters, flourishing becomes impossible. For example, if we cower in fear, we never learn new things, ask cute people to dinner, or go up for promotions. If pleasure rules our lives and we can never say no to any pleasure, we watch our relationships and careers crumble in the face of sensual delights. If we are greedy, we never help others, and others rightly hate us for our callousness toward them. The Aristotelian claim is that our lives are worse if we do not develop the virtues. But trying to understand what someone should do in a situation is difficult. For example, we may know that we must face fear and that courage helps us to face fear well, but how much fear is tolerable, and what should we do in a given situation? To define virtues, Aristotle employs a heuristic, the mean between the extremes. the spot between excess and deficiency. Aristotle compares calculating how to be virtuous to finding the center of a circle or hitting the bullseye of a target. It is difficult and relies on skill, and there are many ways of going wrong. But by knowing the excesses, we can aim between them to find the center. After all, the center of a circle is equidistant from all parts of its boundaries. The analogy places proper development of a trait as equidistant from its malformed extremes. For example, take courage when facing fear. Being overwhelmed by fear in excess will lead to cowardice because someone gives in to fear too easily. But having no fear and disregarding it entirely, deficiency, will lead to foolhardiness because someone who never heeds fear rushes into hopeless situations. Both too much and too little regard for fear destroy the virtue of courage. Excess and deficiency destroy excellent being and action. Courage lies somewhere in the middle. So, in cases where the right thing to do is not obvious, sometimes it helps to consider the wrong things. Then you can find the sweet spot between the extremes of actions. At their most basic level, virtues are dispositions. The Greek word hexis connotes that a person's disposition is a deep feature of her character and nearly unalterable. This contrasts with scasis, which is a more easily changeable state. A dispositional quality is something that someone has unflinchingly. This is easiest to see in negative examples, perhaps as with someone who has the disposition of loving alcohol. If fully developed into a disposition, this person will never turn down a drink, no matter if sated or drunk. Part of something being a disposition is that it is fully developed trait, that it is hard to undo or improve upon in more positive cases. Of course, character traits vary according to how developed they are, and they can be stunted or misapplied such that they hinder living well. But once the character trait has reached the level of a disposition, it is set and arduous to change. The difficulty to change dispositions is why Aristotle and many of the Greeks stress the importance of moral education. Aristotle says, "A good education makes all the difference in the world." It is difficult to change in adulthood what has been set in the 2 decades prior. To form, dispositions require repeated work of a person's entire psychology. They are developed with intent, and actions flowing from a virtue must be decided by the actor and done knowingly. Virtues are not developed by mere chance or compulsion. Rather, they are developed on purpose and are an extension of a person's agency. Aristotle contrasts virtues with skills, technai. Whereas skills only need knowledge, virtues need knowledge, decisiveness, and consistency. This gets Aristotle around the possibility that someone could become happy or virtuous by accident. In the same way that someone who inadvertently spells a complicated word correctly is not a scholar, someone who accidentally does something courageous is not a hero. To be courageous, in the Aristotelian sense, is to have decided to develop the disposition to act courageously and to have developed that trait to fullness over time. A courageous person knows herself and what she can handle. She knows which things in her life and community will most likely inspire fear. She can feel that fear without it overwhelming her, and she does not try to suppress it. She can give an account of why she acts and what she feels when acting, and her life chronicles her psychological development with respect to fear, the many occupations when she has failed and triumphed over fear. A fully courageous person is guided by reason, but has an intimate familiarity with her emotions and habits. She puts in the work of understanding and developing her whole self and putting that self into action. Feelings and manner of execution matter to virtue too. The actor cannot begrudge the right action. People must feel good about doing good things and feel bad about doing bad things or making mistakes. The virtuous are the test of virtues, and it is not enough merely to imitate their actions, that is how we all begin to develop the virtues. Rather, we must also feel the way that they feel. We must do things in the ways that they do things. Meaning, the goal is to do good things with lucid thought and fluid emotions and unconflicted motivations. The virtuous make virtuous action look easy, and that is where we want to get eventually to. Intent, fluidity, and tact matter. For example, the homeless community in Nashville creates and sells a newspaper called The Contributor. and the sales help homeless vendors and community. Buying a newspaper from a homeless person with a hardened heart and an angry thrust of the money toward the vendor does some good. It does buy a paper, but it is not generous. A generous person would feel unconflicted about buying the newspaper, and she would treat the vendor with decency and kindness. To be virtuous, a person cannot merely know what to do and execute an action. She must also feel appropriately about what she does and execute the action appropriately. To be fully virtuous goes beyond achieving a result or setting the right intentions. Manner of execution matters, and everything about the virtuous person is unified toward acting well: thoughts, feelings, and life goals. So, Aristotle argues that we all want to be happy and that happiness is the distinctly human life lived fully and well. It is a life of nutrition and growth, motion and desire, and reason and virtue. Each aspect contributes to fulfilling our human function of living with excellence. The virtues are just the cultivated natural capacities that bring us closer to happiness when interacting with unavoidable aspects of life. They are dispositions to act knowledgeably, decisively, and consistently, and they generate actions that are sensitive to feelings and tact. Good people lead good lives. How to find a virtue in 3 easy steps. So now, we know what happiness and virtues are for Aristotle, but what does this have to do with play? Do all good people play? Can we imagine someone who lives the most complete life and has developed the most exemplary of human characters but does not, at least on occasion, play a game with friends or go out to a movie or maybe hire an elotero to serve Mexican street corn at a watch party of Nacho Libre that he throws for his friends and family? For Aristotle, the answer is clear. No such person exists. All good people play. In the previous chapter, we saw how he specifically defended that children ought to play because it helps their bodies and minds to develop, and that adults use play to rest from daily labors. Perhaps his clearest statement was that he closed his grandest political treatise by arguing that the fully just community will educate its citizens not only in practical things such as gramma, reading and writing, and graphe, drawing, diagramming, and drafting. All of those things help people conduct business and coordinate their efforts with others. Aristotle added 2 more essential subjects to proper education: gymnasion, physical training, and musicae, the arts of the muses, especially music and poetry. He even went as far as to say that states like Sparta or other imperialistic, war-hungry states failed because they did not educate their citizens to be able to live a life of peace and leisure. Free people need the liberal arts. They must be able to use their leisure time well. Free people do not spend all their time doing utilitarian things or plotting the next war. This, minimally, tells us that Aristotle felt that some instances of play were morally permissible, able to be done in a moral life. But I think it actually shows that play is a necessary part of a good life, if only developmentally and psychologically. How else can children develop, adults rest, and states have a populace that does not use their free time in destructive manners? And yet, we also saw in the previous chapter that Aristotle felt that only proper play is ethically permissible. And even so, proper play cannot be the end goal of life. Vulgar play deserves literal beatings, he argued. He also repeatedly exclaimed the absurdity of the idea that spending all of our leisure at play. Aristotle was of 2 minds. Aristotle did little to resolve his ambivalence about play, but after this chapter, we might. We now have the answer as to how he might judge play's virtue, by relating it to happiness or virtues. He did not do this, but could he? The immediate and easiest way of potentially judging the ethical value of play would be for Aristotle to relate play to some other virtue. The most likely candidate would be temperance, which helps us regulate our experiences of pleasure and pain. However, I think that this is a bad fit because temperance relates most directly to somatic pleasures, such as eating, drinking, and having sex. The problem is that play of both high and lowbrow varieties seems more complicated than this, even if it involves a fair amount of it. There are many educational and leisure time activities that we would call play that are not so casual as pleasure-inducing idleness. You can ruin idleness by putting in too much effort, but you cannot ruin leisure leisure time play through effort, such as practicing your favorite instrument, lifting heavy weights because you like to, or playing your favorite challenging video game. Pleasure, and so temperance, is part of the process, but it seems as though it is too reductive for what is going on in many leisure activities. We can see this especially if we look at bad examples of play, such as writing racist country songs, giving yourself rhabdomyolysis through overtraining, or yelling slurs at strangers in an online game. Temperance would deem these things unethical in terms of pleasure and pain, but that does not seem to capture the unethical quality here. Aristotle's concerns about immoral play supersede concerns about pleasure and pain. Hypothetically, we might imagine a Jason Aldean loving CrossFitter who posts racist memes on 4chan's B and shouts gamer words in the Call of Duty voice chat as he recovers from rhabdo. Such a hypothetical person's moral missteps would go beyond mere mistakes in pleasure and pain. We could also look at any of Aristotle's other canonical virtues, but none seem like good fits either. The closest alternative might be wittiness, which regulates social pleasures. But this fails to capture what is happening in the example mentioned above too. With play, it seems like there's some element of it that directly impacts flourishing, but Aristotle did not connect it with his existing virtues or any other overarching concern. However, we can. My eventual thesis of the book, which is defended in chapter 4, will be that playfulness is a virtue that helps us regulate our leisure time to rest, develop ourselves, and engage our communities. Play can be virtuous if it helps the playful person use her leisure time well. However, if I want to make this case on consistent Aristotelian grounds, I have to follow the Aristotelian formula. Luckily, after this chapter, you have already seen that, for Aristotle, there are 3 simple steps to finding out whether a character trait is a virtue. Number 1, the eudaemonist requirement. Make sure that the trait under consideration regulates uniquely an emotion or situation in life that all humans experience that affects whether a person can flourish. Number 2, the empirical requirement. Make sure that the trait under consideration is part of the character of all happy people. Stated differently, make sure that no happy person lacks this trait. 3, the psychological requirement. Make sure that the trait under consideration is psychologically complex, involving reason, emotion, motivation, and tact. If a thinker can find a trait that meets all 3 requirements, then she has a strong case for why that trait is a virtue on Aristotelian grounds. My main challenge here is to move from play as an action to playfulness as a character trait. I need to find a universal situation that all humans face that can make or break their happiness. I need to find a trait that all happy people have in common that regulates that situation uniquely. I need to find a trait that admits of psychological complexity, reflecting the intricacies of human character. And to do these things, I examine biology, psychology, sociology, media studies, and philosophy in the next chapter.